Welcome to Stirring Strength, Perspectives on Mental Health and Addiction. I'm your host, Dean Anderson. And on today's show, I have author Joe Lyons. Joe, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dean.
So I'm glad to have you here. You've written a book, and we have it here, and we'll put a little link on the bottom. And it's a really catchy. Like, I just love the look. I love the look of it, and then the title is very, very catchy. It's called Pain Remixed.
Yes.
Yeah. And when me and you had met to talk about being on the show, we were kind of, when I meet with somebody, it's kind of sitting on, what's the topic of conversation?
Right.
But I've come to understand from this book that there's a lot of topics of conversation.
Yes.
So we'll try to narrow it down and just kind of go straight with what was the motivation behind the book? Where did it come from?
Sure. Yeah. And the motivation, it was multi-decade. It actually starts here in London. I was born in London. I lived here until I was 6. And shortly after I moved out of London, unfortunately, my dad died of suicide in '86. And then, unfortunately, 4 years later, my mom died by suicide. And so, by 10 years old, I was sitting there kind of scratching my head, like, what's life look like for me going forward? So it was a painful process, but I learned a ton. I was adopted by my stepdad. I have a younger brother, older sister, amazing family. I think in my 20s, like in university, I was at Wilfrid Laurier in Waterloo, and I just started to feel this appreciation, this gratitude that, wow, like I got through so much with everyone around me supporting. Maybe I can help somebody else. I had no idea at 20 years old what that looked like, but I had this idea of a book one day, and I'm 45 now. So it took me 25 years, and it actually took me 8 years to write this book. Wow. Because it is deeply personal. And if anyone else has written a book, they know also there's like the raw writing process, which for me was incredibly therapeutic. I can't recommend writing enough as a therapeutic outlet. But then you have all the editing and all that kind of stuff. But it's not your typical mental health book. You can tell by the cover, right? The title, Pain Remixed. And music has been a huge therapeutic outlet for me.
It's just your opening vulnerability, talking about the loss in your childhood, tells me that there's a much bigger story to be told.
Yes.
And that in itself is not your normal life experience, so quote unquote,
right.
air quote that.
Yeah.
So I can understand why that might be your normal mental health book. But from your own perspective, what makes it different than your normal, we'll call it a self-help or mental health book? Yeah.
So I'd say it's kind of like a hybrid. It has my memoir stories, right? So it has the stories of me as a kid, teen, adult. I kind of actually split it up into different sides. Like you'd have like an LP. You have let's say like a 2-record LP. So there's like side A, side B, side C, side D.
Okay.
Each chapter is also a record. So there's like record 1, record 2. And the thing again that's unique, there's that piece, the music part. But I'm not just telling my story. I love research. My background is analytics and data research. Okay. I love neuroscience. So there's a number of mental health experts on the areas of like trauma, depression, anxiety, and definitely grief that I've kind of woven in.
Okay.
So it's like sharing my story, helping to educate others, and then sharing my tips. And that's the remix part.
Okay.
Because I kind of look at it like we can remix our pain into something positive. So yeah,
much like the music. Then we take bits and pieces, and we have a sound bite that changed my life, and maybe I can use that to.
Yeah, exactly. It's like people in the music industry or people that have done remixes. You get a sample, and I love learning about samples, especially through like hip hop, house music. You take those samples, but you create something totally new. So it's like my key takeaway in the book is that we can't rewrite our past. We can't go backwards, but we can remix our future.
Yeah.
So we can take those parts of all the challenges that we've had, but there are some really great pieces, right? People in our lives, we can focus on those positive things and then build our new life.
Yeah.
With that.
It's reframing is so important.
Right.
And, and taking those struggles and turning them to lessons, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Very powerful. Would you attribute anything specific to your ability to do that? Is there anything that was like in this book saying my ability to remix my pain was, really strongly focused in one area or something that you had done specifically to do that?
I mean, at the end of the day, even though when I was younger in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of specialized children's grief support like there is today, it was love. Like it was the family and friends that showed up, and they're still showing up. I'm here visiting in London, and I have family here that have been there every step of the way since I was 6, since I was 10, right? So even if you don't have that specialized support, there's those incredible people you can remix your life around and really appreciate them. And then the other piece was then I eventually did get the right therapy in later in life. When I actually got diagnosed with an anxiety disorder when I was 38.
Okay.
And we realized that actually I had an anxiety disorder since I was a kid. And it then made a lot of sense.
Okay.
So I would say that getting through that really tough trauma and grief as a kid, it was the family and friends that showed up. But for most of us know in our adult years, there's things we've probably suppressed. And the anxiety was one thing I had suppressed and I had run away from, and I'd kind of said, no, nothing wrong with me. I can deal with this. Or for myself, I thought I've gotten through life after losing my parents. I can get through. I went through a divorce in my 30s and other things. And I finally said at 38, I need to get help. And I started doing cognitive behavioral therapy, and then learning a whole toolkit like yoga, deep breathing, mindfulness that really helped.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, the anxiety, I think we're all really good at getting comfortable at sitting in our own stuff so that we don't even know that that's where it is. Right. But there's usually some catalyst or something that kind of knocks us a bit to really recognize that there's something there or something different. With being sensitive to, I know that you're an open book, but being sensitive to that, was there anything in your adult life that redirected you to refocus and look at that in a different way?
There were a few things, and I would say that like anxiety kind of just lingers and will bubble up. And even if you don't have an anxiety disorder, it can kind of go from, let's say like a scale of 10 of anxiety, your daily might be 3, then it starts to be like a 5, 8, and then I got to a point where I was at like a 10. And I did have to call 911. I thought I was having a heart attack at home. I mean, it was a full-blown panic attack, but to me, it actually felt like I was having a heart attack and I was dying. I realized afterwards that it was incredible stress, and stress I'd put on myself. I had worked really hard in corporate. I'd been promoted to a director role, but I put so much extra pressure on myself to what a director needed to be, because no one really told me, and I thought I need to be doing all these things, all this stress. For sure, there's childhood trauma, right? And that's always been there. And I had kind of I had understood a lot of the grief and had built a really great life forward, but the anxiety piece I hadn't faced. So when that happened, it was really like the line in my like anxiety-ridden life was drawn. I was like, okay, no, I can't turn away from it. And I went to my family doctor, said, I'm in, let's do this. Like, what do I need to do? And then that's where she recommended CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And I've learned so much. Actually, since I got diagnosed, my mental health has been the best, because I finally knew what was going on. right? And I said, like, I love research. So then I could do all this research. I could learn all these different tips and tricks. And here I am 7 years later, and now I'm actually doing corporate workshops to help others.
So you're using that in the same realm of what, you know, led to your anxiety in the first place.
Yes.
You can see how to use that to help others.
Yesterday I was here in London. I was doing a corporate workshop, doing a presentation for 2 hours, where 7 years ago, actually presenting was something that was really triggering me as well. Was this fear of failure. That a lot of us have a pre-presentation anxiety, a fear of failure for presenting. So yeah, I still feel like extremely fortunate where I am now, you know, keep going through these different cycles of learning and understanding my own mental health. And then now I can hopefully help others.
Right. It sounds like you have a sense of gratitude for that bit of suffering and the anxiety that you went through, because now it's turned into a much bigger purpose. You know, if you had not gone through some of that stuff, you might still be doing status quo.
Right.
That 3 or 4
That's
anxiety.
right. Yeah. It's funny how, and if you've listened to, like, Anderson Cooper has a great podcast about grief. There's more celebrities talking about grief now, right? And loss, like Stephen Colbert. And other celebrities, Molly Shannon as well from SNL wrote a great book, Hello Molly. And I think that obviously we would love to go back in a heartbeat and not have that happen, right? And we would give any, like, I would give any asset. It doesn't even, like, come into my mind. I would give anything in a heartbeat to say, go back and save my parents. But when you realize you can't, and then I think as you grow and mature, and then as you're healing, some of us are able to then take that pain, that piece of it, and then ultimately turn it into, like, a purpose. You know, so the proceeds for this book are all donated to this really great charity called Season Center for Grieving Children.
Oh, wow.
Okay, they're based up in Barrie, but they support grieving children, teens, and young adults throughout Ontario. I've been an executive grief ambassador with them for 4 years. Just this past year, I've become a grief facilitator volunteer. And it has just completely changed my view of my grief. Like, it's hard to say it's a positive thing, but I just feel that I've kind of gone through everything for a certain reason, and now it's to help other people.
Why would you say you struggle with making it a positive thing? Or to say it's
I think that
say it's a positive thing.
It's funny because I'm still doing all this work.
Oh, okay.
But it's hard. It's still hard for my part of my brain to say it was a positive thing, because it almost makes me feel guilty.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's a big part of grief, isn't it?
It definitely is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially if you've gone through a more complicated grief, like suicide loss, accidental overdose, or murder, there's a different level of, like, shame and guilt that's accompanied with it. So that part takes a while. And I think it's hard to let that go, that you can be positive about what it's become.
Yeah.
You know,
in the counseling world and in the therapy realm, we like to talk about, you know, both things able to be true. Like, things can be true. Like, there can be positive experiences, and also recognize that it doesn't need to be a dichotomy. It doesn't need to be one or the other.
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So it can participate in both worlds. I not to poke at that idea. I mean, obviously there's things that are going to be negative or have you know, negative emotions attached to that process. But I would like to, you know, talk a little bit more about that work that you're doing.
Yeah.
And, you know, how that integrates into your own personal, like, your lived experience.
Right.
Obviously has a lot of value when it comes to being able to be a grief counselor, participating in that. And I would love to hear a little bit more about the value that lived experience may have.
Yeah. So the way the program works, Season Center, they're actually celebrating their 30th year this year. And they offer, like, free peer-to-peer programs. So essentially they'll have different groups of children. Usually they'll group them by age group, but then also by loss type. So I do work with a group that has primarily lost someone close to them, usually a parent or sibling to suicide.
Okay.
And I think it's just a very natural fit for me to be able to have so much empathy. And when we're doing different activities about grief, like we do things very, not your typical, like, sit there for a bit and to talk for an hour. Grief for children is very physical.
Okay.
Right? So we do like art activities, we do other sports and things, reading books. But yeah, I think it gives me a really unique lens to understand and maybe ask the child, like, oh, like, have you ever felt like this at all? Because I remember I felt like that when my mom died, or like, you ever thought about this? Because I can kind of relate, like when my dad died, or I felt alone, or I felt like, especially for boys, I'd say I felt like I couldn't cry because I didn't want to show weakness and things like that. So I just felt extremely comfortable there. But like you said, it can be both, like kind of tough and positive. So we have this fun physical room, the volcano room. It's all padded, all these teddy bears. You can swing into the teddy bears. It's a ball pit. There's like air hockey, right? So it's like we talk about our grief in a certain way with the kids. We do an art activity, but then we go work it out together. I leave there like happy, like we're high-fiving the kids at the end. And I think it does really give actually a positive attachment to the grief.
I'm fascinated by this. We got to go to a quick break, and we're going to come and jump right where we left off, because this is great stuff. Thanks, Joe. We'll be right back with more Stirring Strength. Welcome back to Stirring Strength. We're having a wonderful conversation with the author of Pain Remixed, Joe Lyons. Joe, before the break, you were talking about your participation in the Seasons Center, and we're going to have that put on the screen for you so that people can see that. But the work that you're doing with other young adults, and right before we went to break, you were kind of talking, and I felt there was a segue going into how it's cathartic for you,
right,
to process those things, in addition to being a support for the children, and that both things can be true. I would love to hear more about how that process is helpful for you in the processing of your grief.
I mean, it's an incredibly positive experience for me. And I leave there with just like a big full heart and of gratitude. I think that, and I've felt this in volunteer work with them and other children's charities before that, it is such a pure moment of joy. If anyone's ever helped out, if they've maybe they've given out food at a shelter on Christmas, or they've done other volunteer work for a food bank or people in need in our community, and there's so many that need support in our community, especially with mental health. It's just this incredible, I think, human experience that you basically put your own needs or like ego in the background. You put someone else's needs before yours, and you can't buy that in therapy. It's a whole different experience. So even our business, our company's called Data Gives Back.
Okay.
Right, we're a social enterprise. I started it after quitting my job in corporate during the pandemic in 2020. We donate 25% of our revenue to Seasons Center for Grieving Children.
Cool.
So even just that, and whether I'm training someone in data analytics, it could be even Excel, as nerdy as that is, I feel great every day. Right? There's a bigger purpose, there's a bigger thing happening. Even if I'm a bit burnt out from running a lot of data analytics or things like that, it feels different. So I highly encourage, if anyone's able to, does not have to be monetary. You can go out and just give back your time to the community.
Service is so important, and in the work I do, I see a lot of it happen within the 12-step world, and within the idea of people giving back what they've had given to them, and participating in that process has a lot to do with self-esteem and self-worth and connection, and there's a whole bunch of value to that. But there's also a part of it where we can vicariously help ourselves through our previous experiences through the process of helping somebody else.
Yes.
Like it's a an act of self-compassion. Me having compassion for you is an act of self-compassion for the younger me or the person that might have been struggling in the past. Is that an experience that?
You have a different appreciation. I think that when, again, you're just being really empathetic, compassionate, you're listening, and you're, listening to other people's struggles, but then their kind of pain to purpose journey. And I have that all the time, especially in mental health. People I get to work with, and I look at them and I'm like, wow. Like even the founder of Season Center, the co-founder, Rolly Ramey, both of his daughters unfortunately died of a tragic car accident in the mid-90s. He founded Season Center because he was dealing with his own grief. And he had this like altruistic idea that, well, if I'm having trouble getting resources, I don't see any resources for kids.
Wow.
So I'm going to start this foundation. And here we are like 30 years later. And he's someone that inspires me daily to keep going. Because it is definitely like the grief journey is definitely not linear. Even the giving back piece is not, right? Not every day is the same. But having those people like surrounding us in our lives is just incredibly inspiring and powerful. So those are the people that help me keep going and keep being creative.
That's wonderful. You were talking about the youth processing grief in a different way, and being a little bit more active in art and play. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. It's tough for a lot of kids, tweens, to be able to formulate the language and express verbally, right, what they're feeling. And there's one part which is expressing your feelings. The other part is actually just processing through, because the grief process is a full body piece, right? So is trauma, depression, anxiety. So you actually physically will feel it, right? Different parts of your muscles, your energy levels. And so, whether you're going to do something like a physical activity, like for me growing up, I played a lot of different sports. That really helped me relieve some of that intense grief as a kid, because I was not verbalizing it.
Sure.
I was not telling people how sad I was, and I was trying to be strong and not cry, which I obviously not the best thing in a healthy way to process grief, but I found that those outlets help me. So I think that that's the thing about understanding, is that your child could be grieving, but they're not going to have the brain development to tell you their deep feelings.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you can also pick up on their physical cues, like their energy levels, just how they're showing up daily. And then, maybe ask them, like, do you want to do something physical? Like, do you want to play a sport? Or I'm also a big supporter of art. Obviously there's a book, the DJing part. Art has also been a great outlet. So that's another great way that your mind kind of gets focused on a great escape.
Okay.
Like art, music, whatever that is. And you can take a break from the heaviness of grief and different mental health challenges.
So a sense of expression and being able to take things that maybe we might not be able to articulate and express in another way, physically, mentally, or through art form. As you're talking, my brain's going up a million miles a minute thinking about that idea of youth as a whole not being able to articulate and use the words that adults assume that they could or should.
Right.
And at the same time, we superimpose our idea of what it should look like to grieve onto a child, and either they're okay because they're not showing any of it, right? Or if they're acting deviant, then there's something wrong with their morals or their ethics or something, opposed to having some other sort of emotional thing, right?
Exactly. And right now, with just the increased rates of anxiety and depression in teens and tweens today, it's not necessarily something that they're choosing to do. And again, they're not fully developed enough to be able to express it.
Sure.
And it'll show up differently, right? On how they go through it versus say like myself. And I have 2 daughters. And so I think as parents, especially going through COVID if you have children or you're working with children, that was a huge grief trigger, but in a unique grief, because we were grieving our old lives. We were grieving the missed events that we did. And that's still lingering today with a lot of people.
Yeah. For the audience at home, recognizing that grief really means the processing of loss, right? And it could be a whole different kinds of loss. It doesn't necessarily need to be loss of a loved one. It could be a job or an old way of living or an environment. It could even be a thing, right? So that process can be different for everybody. I'm curious about your unique perspective on grief, and knowing that you went through your life and then you got to an adult place where you're now looking back on it. Was there anything when you look back on it that you say, wow, I didn't realize that was part of grief? There was something I was doing or acting or being a certain way that I didn't know was part of my grieving process, now that you have a better understanding and knowledge of it?
Yeah, it's honestly, there's a number of things. And I would say that I didn't have that specialized grief support like Season Center has now. So there were certain things that I was doing. I'd say even like in school, for example, I was close to an A student before my mom died. My grade 5, because she died in November of '89. I barely passed the rest of the year. And I had a new teacher that came in on a mat leave kind of halfway through. So she didn't have any history of what had happened to me. I started getting these report cards that was like, he's not doing his work. He's like, he really needs to like pick up the pace and all these kind of things. Like not understanding that brain fog is very real. Because whenever I try to sit down and concentrate, I would just bawl my eyes out, because my crying only happened in my own room by myself for the most part. So I think that's one thing too, is that's extremely common for anyone really after grief, is brain fog. But for me personally, that was I still have that report card.
Wow.
Yeah, even when I was when I was writing the book, because I do talk about it in the book.
Oh wow.
Is that piece. So
right. So we are running out of time, and I could talk to you for hours about this, Joe. If you could give a short bit of advice to anyone in the grieving process, something that they would benefit from participating in, what do you think it would be?
I would say that understand that grief is a very normal human response.
Awesome.
Okay. And we can ask for help, because we weren't meant to grieve alone.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Connection's so important. Thanks for being on the show today, Joe. I appreciate you being here. Thank you for watching Stirring Strength, and we'll pop up a link for Joe's book on the page here. Thanks again, Joe.
Thank you.
See you next time.